Ophelia. Quite by chance, Bill Harnden survived the nuclear war. Normally he would have been lecturing at Bristol University, but that afternoon he had to drive to Bath for a meeting of the Southwest Arts Committee. Suddenly a woman came running from a wayside cottage and flagged him down. She told him her name was Erica Kowalski and she was a leading authority in the cellular cloning of vegetable and animal protein. She showed him a blue identity card which guaranteed her a place in any nuclear fallout shelter, and begged him to drive her there. Bill had been fully aware of the dangerous international situation, but that was the first he had heard of the imminence of a nuclear attack. It was the car radio, not Erica Kowalski, which finally convinced him it was really happening. His first instinct was to turn the car around and head for home. But home was 30 miles away across the River Severn, and London had already been here. With Bristol next on the strike list, he knew he would never make it. All he had time for was to save the woman and himself. "My pass will cover both of us," she said urgently. Shocked out of thinking, Bill Harnden followed her directions, drove along Blyrods east of Bath. The road led uphill towards a wooded escarpment and he could see the streets of Georgian houses below, traffic snarl ups along the motorway, and hear the sirens of police cars wailing. Then the road dipped down again and quiet fields took over, England on a sleepy afternoon in early summer, full of bluebells and buttercups and cattle grazing. He could not believe it was all about to end. "Turn left at the next junction," Erica Kowalski said. High wire fences and red notice boards told him that the area had belonged to the Ministry of Defense, and wire gates guarded the entrance to a disused stone quarry. Soldiers checked the woman's pass and waved Bill through. He parked among armored cars and black official limousines, transferred to an army truck full of civic dignitaries and top civil servants, and was driven away. A concrete tunnel and a roadway of curving light led deep inside a hill. Corridors branched away in all directions like blood vessels from a heart. He stood and waited in a great reception hall, a lone civilian among all the military personnel. It was more than a bunker. It was a vast purpose-built subterranean city, a labyrinth of rooms and passageways, as if the whole hill had been hollowed out. It was not the only one, Erica Kowalski informed him. Scattered over England there were maybe a dozen underground complexes such as this. He guessed he could count himself lucky as the outer doors closed and sealed him inside. Or was it luck, Bill thought, to be separated from his wife and children, to know that they died whilst he lived on, alone in his cell room shared with a couple of American GIs, sitting on a hard bunk bed and staring at the blank pale green walls around him. Somehow he could not think of it as luck. Apart from his briefcase containing lecture notes, a volume of Shakespeare's Hamlet which Veronica had given him for Christmas, and a photograph of her and the children which he kept in his wallet, he had brought nothing with him to remind him of his former life. He was a man in a vacuum, and everything he loved was swept away. Time, of course, healed his grief. He grew used to the regimented routine of the bunker, mealtimes and work shifts, days and nights that began and ended with the sound of a buzzer. He grew used to the communal living of dining halls, assembly halls, shower and relaxation rooms, Grant and Elmer who shared his cell, and the total lack of privacy. A degree in English literature was useless there, and so was he. He was put to work in the supplies department, shifting dehydrated foodstuffs from the storerooms to the canteen kitchen, a man in a navy blue government-issued overall, number 423 on the admissions list, his identity gone. Among all the high-ranking Army and Air Force personnel, among all the Lord Mayors, county surveyors, education, and police chiefs, top scientists, communications experts, district administrators, and gum-chewing Americans from the nearby airbase, Bill was just a low-status civilian in the bottom grade of the hierarchy. He did what he was told and was not expected to question it, nor did he know what went on among the upper echelons of power. General McAllister, who was in charge of the Avon bunker, was not a man to be found mixing socially with his subordinates. A remote mustachioed figure in a khaki uniform, he issued the orders, but he did not confide. All Bill knew of the overall situation was what filtered down to him through the ranks. As Elmer so succinctly put it, The contingency plans for surviving nuclear war had been one almighty cock-up. The Avon bunker had been constructed to house 750 people, with supplies for up to 2 years. In actual fact, less than 500 of those who had been designated places reached it in time. Due to radioactive fallout, communication with other bunkers was impossible to establish, nor, at the end of the statutory 14 days, could anyone begin to administer law and order and emergency aid to the surviving population of the Bath-Bristol region. It was more than 6 weeks before the radiation level dropped below critical. By that time there was apparently no civilian population left alive. The cities were flattened and the nuclear winter had already set in. Temperatures plummeted way below zero. England became as cold as Siberia and the dust remained in the upper atmosphere obscuring the sun. Snow lay 6 meters thick, covering the ruins of cities in a white freezing shroud. There could be no reconnoitering, no aerial surveys to assess the final damage. Radio communication still remained difficult, but it seemed that 3 major bunkers at Plymouth, Cheltenham and Cardiff had not survived. Those surviving in the minor bunkers were cut off, some buried beneath the rubble of buildings, some short of supplies. But the blizzards raged. Hurricane-force winds had been recorded, and Avon could not desist. Stocked to administer to the requirements of the whole Bristol-Bath catchment area, there was no shortage of food or clothing or medical supplies in the Avon bunker. But the prefabricated field hospitals, tent shelters for the homeless and mobile soup kitchens, were never used. The pre-war estimates for survival had been proved wrong. For those outside, the chance of survival was next to nothing, and those in the bunker were there for life. Bill Harnden would never be going home. The nuclear winter lasted for almost 2 years. Not until the sunlight returned and the long darkness ended could the government bunkers begin to collate their evidence. From Cambridge, Cumbria, Avon, Aberdeen, Hereford, Derby, and Yorkshire, the helicopters made their surveys. Incredibly, people had survived outside, but the population of the British Isles, which, before the war, had been an estimated 65 million, had been reduced to a handful. Tiny scattered settlements of people struggling to survive in the desolate wastes of a once productive land. And for them it was only the beginning. Sickness, starvation, mutation and radiation-linked cancers would reduce them still further over the years to come. Nothing grew in the cold black deserts of nuclear dust. But the slow sun warmed the land, and in a few more months, the scientists predicted, it would begin to grow. Then it was discovered that the ozone layer around the Earth had been damaged by the Holocaust and too much ultraviolet light was passing through the atmosphere. This would cause skin burns, skin cancer, retinal damage to the eyes, and congenital deformity. Protective clothing had to be worn by anyone venturing outside, and it seemed that human beings would never again freely inhabit the surface of the Earth. Bill Harnden continued his life in the Avon bunker, but he was not entirely happy with the situation. Military men with no one left to conquer, administrators with no population to administer, civic dignitaries, civil servants, and police chiefs, were all professionally redundant, no different from himself. Yet they continued to cling to the ranks the world had once bestowed on them, and expected him to obey. They seemed to think that they, like the children of Israel, were the chosen few. The military, civic and academic elite, destined to rule over a kingdom that would soon recover. A Union Jack flag fluttered, red, white, and blue, a symbol of triumph on the top of an empty hill. It did not occur to them that Britain, like the rest of the civilized world, had been defeated. It is our duty, General McAllister said, to restore this country to what it was. He actually believed it could happen, that the mines would reopen, the factories would be rebuilt, and industry would start again. Planning committees were formed. New contingency plans were drawn up and submitted to central government in the Berkshire bunker, and their own bunker extended outward. Bill was transferred from stores to manual labor. Along with Grant and Elmer, supervised by an American Army colonel by the name of Jeff Allison, and dressed in white protective suits, he helped to clear the surrounding land of its sterile surface of dust. The prefabricated field units were put into use, bolted to metal girders, and the whole area roofed over with sheets of transparent corrugated plastic to form a vast glass house. They grew fresh vegetables and cereal crops, and Erica Kaulansky went to work in the food processing laboratory. The first batch of cloned root vegetables were harvested 8 weeks later, and army personnel with government requisition orders scoured the surrounding countryside for any animals which might have survived. Half a dozen sheep, a few dozen chickens and 3 goats were brought to the bunker from a settlement in the Cotswold Hills. Legalized theft, which formed the basis of a breeding flock. Egg yolk was cloned, but the fertilized chicken embryos all showed signs of mutation, and new grass in the outside field seared brown in the sun. They lacked the means for successfully breeding and raising livestock, and women, who had not rated very high on the government's list of priority survivors, suddenly assumed a significance. Apart from a few elderly wives and growing daughters, there were only 32 women in the whole bunker who were capable of conceiving and giving birth to children, and Erica Kaulansky was one of them. Bill never really knew why she sought him out. It had nothing to do with love and little to do with affection. She admitted, quite freely, that she had never wanted marriage or children, that she found the idea abhorrent. But now she saw it as a necessary duty, and she was not the kind of woman to turn her back. Bill understood. She was not offering to be a wife to him in the way Veronica had been. She had simply chosen him to father her child. And 1 year later, after a long and difficult labor, Eric gave birth to a baby girl. She was 41 years old and Bill was almost 50. And even if it was her duty, Erica swore she would never go through it again. She was a woman devoid of all maternal instincts, and maybe that was why she had chosen Bill for a mate. She had sensed perhaps that he would make up for her inadequacy, that he had fathered before and would love the child enough for both of them. Under the white-hot lights of the hospital ward, Bill took his daughter in his arms. She did not remind him of William or Catherine. She reminded him of Sarah, Wagner Regis Polytechnic, and a marriage gone wrong. Marriage to Erica was wrong too, but he could not regret this child. She would make up for the children he had lost, and he could not love her more. In the next bed to Erica, Jeff Allison's wife cradled her second Anglo-American son. Wayne Jeffrey, like his brother Dwight, had been conceived out of love, not duty. Next time, Mrs. Allison vowed, she too would have a girl. But Bill smiled down at his own little daughter and knew he would never have another. The small face puckered to cry, and Erica handed him the feeding bottle. "What will you call her?" Mrs. Allison asked. "Ophelia," said Bill. "And let her not walk in the sun." Ophelia assumed she would never walk in the sun. For her it was a dim yellow disk seen through the plastic roof of the cultivation area, an M-type star 93 million miles distant. It shone on the great solar panels on the hilltop above her and indirectly provided her with warmth and light, charging the battery cells that worked the electric generator on which life in the bunker depended. She was not unhappy in her little regimented world of rooms and passageways. She had been born and brought up there and knew nothing different. In the schoolrooms her father taught what life had been like before the Holocaust, but to Ophelia it did not seem relevant. And although she loved the rich language of English literature, scepter dial set in silver seas and seasons of mists and mellow fruitfulness, it was all remote and unreal, as unreal as the images seen in dreams and instantly forgotten. It was ancient history. Western civilization, like the Greek and Roman empires, was irretrievably gone. Only the memory was kept alive, the ambition to rebuild it which General McAllister conceived as a duty, and Dwight Allison said was futile. Ophelia did not much care who was right or wrong. She saw only what was actual, an outside world that was treeless and hostile, a landscape eroded by wind and rain and sun. Telescreens showed it in the main communications room, outside cameras panning the rock-strewn deserts of Avon and Gloucestershire, Wiltshire and Somerset. Rain had washed away the surface soil. Snow, and frost, and fog of winter gave way in summer to bleak-baked hills and barren valleys where nothing much grew. Just tussocks of brittle grass, a few hardy flowers and pockets of vegetation along the river margins. Packs of scavenging dogs hunted the tiny nomadic herds of sheep and goats that roamed the plains, and red pins on a map of England showed the scattered communities of human survivors. But there were none nearby. It was bad land around the bunker and the ultraviolet light was too intense for agriculture. Mostly the northern hemisphere could not support much life. Years before the aerial surveys had shown the continents laid waste, from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean, across industrial Europe and the United States of America. A world gone dead. Now the supply of petrol and diesel had almost run out and no one knew if anything had changed among the settlements of human survivors. There was no population census and long ago people had moved away from the surrounding countryside, taken what animals they had and fled to the hills to escape from the government requisition orders. Inside the bunker nothing ever changed. It was a constant environment, just as Ophelia had always known it. Maybe, as Dwight said, it got a little crummier with every day that passed, but it was hardly noticeable. Except when the electric generator broke down and had to be repaired. And although the concrete structure was cracked and crumbling in places, the videos and computers went on working, and Ophelia assumed they would go on working forever. Cloned vegetables grew in the culture tanks in Erica's laboratory. Edible protein was culled from blue-green algae, and extract of sugar beet provided sweetness. Food plants flourished in the cultivation area where the sunlight filtered through the plastic roof and the rain rattled. Ophelia liked to go there, walk among the smells of damp earth and green things growing, among the splashed colors of ripe red tomatoes and yellow marrow flowers. Sometimes, after watching a video film or visiting the cultivation area, she could almost envisage the lost world her father talked of. But she could not imagine the taste of chocolate biscuits, the smell of beefsteak braised in wine, or the song of the blackbird. Bill Harnden could not convey taste, or scent, or sound, to someone brought up in concrete corridors, on cloned egg yolk and carrot juice, where human voices were the only natural sounds. He could not convey past realities in a windowless classroom to these children of the dust. Without textbooks or writing materials he tried to teach them literature and history. With only computer video pictures he tried to teach them art. Lacking the basic tools for making things he tried to teach them crafts. He insisted they needed a fully comprehensive education, that concentration on maths, and science, and computer learning, did not make for a balanced intellect. He believed that a teacher was more than an educational supervisor, that human interactions were of paramount importance to understanding, that the stimulation of a child's imagination was even more necessary than teaching it to calculate. On those issues he clashed with the bunker hierarchy, with the education chief, with General McAllister, and with his wife. "We need creative thinkers," said Bill. "Not a generation of automatons." "Logical thought can be just as creative," Erica said. "It's a dead end without imagination. The human brain has two sides to it and both are meant to be used. What's the good in raising calculative geniuses who are incapable of understanding anything but their own calculations? One track minds, blind to all else?" In the small family apartment with pale green walls, where the paint flaked away to show bare plaster underneath, Ophelia listened as her parents exchanged words. Usually, in the evenings, there was only herself and her father with Erica working away in the laboratory, but tonight she had joined them. The conversation that had begun in the dining hall over a meal of chicken-flavored soybean stew still continued. Apparently Mrs. Allison was having trouble with Dwight, and Erica blamed Bill. She said his teaching methods were filling Dwight's head with stuff and nonsense and rebellious ideas. "These young people have to accept things as they are," Erica said. "They don't need to know how things used to be, or what things might become again in the future. We don't need dreamers. We need scientists and technologists. They're the ones who will make the breakthrough, Bill. They're the ones on whom our future depends." "You are darned right," said Bill. "Our future does depend on them. Their ability to create something better than the world we have now, or the world of the past. If they don't know about the past they have nothing to compare the present to, and nothing to feed their imagination on which a future society depends. That imagination has to be fostered in the right way," Erica retorted. "You are encouraging them to want what they can't have. Flipping poetics, Bill. Beauty, and truth, and freedom, the pursuit of personal happiness. There's no room for that in an enclosed environment. Dwight Allison is a very clever boy. We need his skills. If we can't get a breakthrough in genetic engineering, then we'll have to go on living underground. He could design the city of the future. A brilliant architect, Bill, if you don't turn him into a blasted revolutionary. What use is an architect who can't make bricks? Bill asked her. We're teaching all the wrong things. If we forget how to use our hands and our hearts, what good can we do with our heads? Who's going to build the fabled city? When the time comes, we'll recruit outside workers, Erica said. Suppose they don't want to be recruited? Oh come on, Bill. Everyone has to work for a living. They are working, woman. They're working for themselves. Working to survive in conditions as we have never known. What right do we have to expect them to give up their own enterprises and work for us? It's you who are the dreamer, Erica. You, and the rest of the Make Britain Great Again brigade. This place will fall down around our ears whilst you're still sitting on your backside hoping for a scientific breakthrough. It's not going to happen. And Dwight sees that. Ophelia chewed her fingernails. Her parents quarreled. They seldom did anything else but quarrel. They were not like Dwight's parents, loving each other and him. Harsh light shone on the green linoleum floor, shone on her father's gray hair and Erica's spectacles. There was a flush on her face, and her eyes flashed with annoyance, and she was not about to give up. Without technology you wouldn't be alive now, Erica said furiously. And countless millions of people wouldn't be dead, retorted Bill. Lest we forget, it was science and technology that invented the bomb and devastated the earth. Not to mention blokes like McAllister with his blind obedience to central government policy. Is that what you call creative thinking, Erica? Erica put on her white laboratory overall. I'm going, she said. Maybe one day you'll face it, said Bill. There was a knock on the door, and Erica opened it. Domestic harmony is one beautiful thing, said Colonel Allison in his slow American drawl. You can hear it all the way to the recreation room. What do you want? Erica asked sourly. Ophelia, said Colonel Allison. A message from Dwight. There's baseball in the storage depot and you're to report to second base. And stop biting your nails, said her father. There were 122 children in the Avon bunker, their ages ranging from Mrs. Sutcliffe's 2-month-old baby to Dwight Allison, who was 17. There was a creche and kindergarten for the little ones and graded education for the rest. Schooling began at 09:00 hours and ended at 17:00 hours, and included supervised sports sessions with Sergeant Major Wilkinson in the recreation hall. With so many experts in the bunker they did not lack qualified tuition. At 16 Ophelia was already studying advanced genetics with Dr. Stevenson 2 afternoons a week. She knew how to dissect the ovum of a rat and isolate the chromosome that gave rise to mutational blindness. She could remove and replace it with a non-mutated chromosome from a bunker-bred rat. But in the next generation the mutation recurred. In cartography Bernard Sowerby was updating ordnance survey maps from aerial photographs, and Dwight was working on designs for an elevator shaft to a projected lower basement area. Educationally they were far in advance of pre-war standards, yet they were still considered children. They still played baseball in the storage depot, collected cockroaches and raced them along the dining hall tables, fed invasion messages from outer space into the main computer, and got rips in the navy blue government-issued overalls. They were still, during weekends and evenings, part of the noisy unruly horde of youngsters who careered through the confines of the bunker, believing it unconditionally theirs. But once too often some unidentified child robbed the cultivation area of its ripe tomatoes, and once too often some unidentified child visited the communications room, overheard communiques from central government, and blabbed restricted information. A rumor spread that the Prime Minister was dead and Air Marshal Hughes had taken over. Bill Harnden discussed it during a schoolroom debate. Is this the end of democracy? He asked. What democracy? Said Dwight. Avon has been a totalitarian state for the last 20 years. Ophelia was not much interested in politics. The bunker had always been run by General McAllister, and it made no difference to her who ran the country as a whole. It was General McAllister who imposed the restrictions, placed the cultivation area in the communications room out of bounds to all persons under the age of 18. She missed the feel of sunlight through plastic, the smells of warmth and dampness and green things growing. She missed the blue of the sky and the gray-black deserts seen on the telescreens. Her concrete world seemed shrunken in size. Now her only visual stimuli were the pale green walls of the bunker, the geometrical perspectives of rooms and corridors, human faces and the schoolroom computer screens. Something of freedom had been taken away and she experienced a feeling of loss. But it never occurred to her to question it. She had been brought up to respect the routine and the discipline, the restrictions imposed on her life. For the good of all people she was prepared to accept a personal loss, but there were other young people who were not so willing. They met in the storage depot, most of Bill Harnden's senior pupils who usually played in the baseball match. White paint on the concrete floor marked out their pitch, but that evening was different. Younger children played in the defunct refrigeration units, or clamored about the broken army vehicles parked at the far end. But the older ones huddled together, seated on pre-war packing cases in a dimly lit corner of a huge cavernous room. Rust and paint tins were piled against a nearby wall and their voices echoed, angry and indignant. "McAllister's got no right," Dwight said bitterly. "You mean we've got no rights?" said Bernard Sowerby. "Nobody has," said his sister. "Nobody has any real say in how this bunker is run. I even heard Pop say he was sick of following orders," Wayne Allison said. "But he still goes on doing it," Dwight said angrily. "He's got no choice," said Gaynor. "Nor is McAllister," said Spotty Harris. "He gets his orders from central government." "It's not central government who banned us from going into the communications room," Dwight said furiously. "It's that pig McAllister. The man's a military dictator. He wasn't voted into office, so what right does he have to rule us?" "What does it matter who rules us?" Ophelia remarked. Dwight rounded on her. "If it doesn't," he said, "then it damned well ought to. Your father spent the last 5 years trying to tell us. It's the right, and duty, and responsibility, of every individual to question everyone and anyone who assumes authority over us. If those millions of people had gotten off their backsides and questioned what they all knew was going on, maybe they wouldn't be dead, and we wouldn't be stuck in this crummy bunker. No one should have power over other people. We've seen what governments and men like McAllister can do. They not only destroy people's lives but the whole damned world. And if you don't know that, Ophelia, you must be stupid." Ophelia stared at him. She had known Dwight Allison all her life and he had never once spoken to her like that. Tears pricked the backs of her eyes as she turned and walked away. Silence followed her across the cold concrete spaces. She heard an army truck back from its sortie come rumbling along the main tunnel. Young children giggled in the refrigeration unit, and the intercom crackled ordering Police Chief James to report to administration. Ophelia pushed open the closed double doors and entered the corridor. Footsteps came running behind. There were strip lights missing from the ceiling, making areas of gloom, and she thought it was Dwight. But it was Wayne, his brother, who fell into step. "Dwight didn't mean it," he said. "So why did he say it?" Ophelia asked. "Mom says it's the age he's at." "You were only 1 year younger than he is. And you didn't call me stupid." "He's lousy to everyone," said Wayne. Men from the army truck came whistling along the corridor. They wore white suits with clear plastic visors that made them eyeless in the light. They talked of finding petrol at Milford Haven, thousands of gallons in an untapped storage tank, enough to send the helicopter out on an aerial survey, airborne again after 7 years. "Did you hear what they said?" Wayne asked excitedly. Ophelia leaned against the wall. She did not care about the helicopter or what it might find. She only cared about Dwight. 16 years of friendship coming to an end because he was having trouble growing up. Ophelia was growing up too, but she had not let it spoil things. And it was not just hormones causing Dwight to change his attitude towards her. It was her father's teaching methods. Ophelia had not been present when Dwight found this break-in and wrote the message on the wall. "General McAllister is a fascist pig," in huge blood-red letters in the pale green corridor. She heard of it later, after some young child had innocently pointed the accusing finger and Dwight had admitted his guilt. Colonel Allison offered to deal with him in a way he would never forget, but instead Dwight had to appear before the disciplinary committee. He was sentenced to 12 months menial labor, clearing raw sewage from the septic tanks and spreading it to dry on the river fields. As for the rest of Bill Harnden's students who might share similar views, General McAllister came personally to the schoolroom to deliver a lecture. For an hour and a half he went droning on about dangerous left-wing ideals and extreme socialist principles, about the threat to democracy which had resulted in nuclear war, and why subversive political activity would not be tolerated now. There was no such thing as freedom without order, General McAllister said, just degeneration into lawless anarchy and social chaos. That's why I'm in authority, and why we have rules in this bunker, General McAllister barked. And that's why I expect you to stick to them. We're all British citizens and we need to pull together to get this country back on its feet. We've got no room for deviance. Those of you who don't like the way things are run will have their chance to voice their complaints when the new parliamentary system has been established. We intend to keep the spirit of democracy alive. That's what we've always fought for, and what we'll go on fighting for. We, of the military, are here to protect the democratic principle. Meanwhile, a state of international emergency still exists which requires that we continue as we are. But the continuation was not the same. Dwight was banished from the schoolrooms and gone from Ophelia's life. "I hope you're satisfied," Erica said to Bill. "I told you this would happen. That boy was an impressionable age and you encouraged him in his foolish thinking. I taught him to think for himself, that's all. And what good has it done him?" "Hopefully," said Bill, "it will make him a better man. Or waste what he could have been." Ophelia did not know what Dwight had become or what effect the punishment was having on him. She seldom saw him anymore. With the sounding of the 8 o'clock work buzzer he donned his white protective suit and went outside, day after day among the dung and dust, creating a few more fertile acres that might one day grow. Ophelia only knew what Wayne told her, that Dwight not only smelled shitty, he was also a shit to live with, and all he and Colonel Allison did was yell at each other. It was Erica who told her that Dwight had been moved to a single room on the opposite side of the underground complex. And it was Erica, more than her father, who seemed to understand how Ophelia felt, bereft and purposeless, her life gone empty of meaning. She had to find something for herself, said Erica, become a complete person within herself and not rely on relationships to make her whole and happy. Love from a member of the opposite sex was not the be-all and end-all of a woman's existence. You don't need Dwight Allison to become a good geneticist, Erica said. You can do that quite well without having him around. Genetics were not everything, Ophelia thought. Without Dwight she could feel no pleasure. There were no more baseball games. The storage depot was abandoned and socially the group drifted apart, split into individuals, pairs or trios of particular friends. It was as if Dwight had been the one who kept them together, motivated their activities, molded them into a unity. Without him they lacked cohesion and had nothing in common. All the life and laughter of joint enterprises seemed to be gone. Weekends and evenings were long and boring and Ophelia bit her fingernails until they bled. Will you stop doing that? Her father said. What else is there to do? Ophelia asked bitterly. Try learning, he replied. You are already using the computer, so how can I? In the swivel chair Bill swung around to face her. The screen behind him showed an extract from Macbeth. Ophelia wanted to hate him because she believed, like Erica, that what had happened to Dwight was all his fault. But a photograph fluttered to the floor and she picked it up. She had seen it before. It was a photograph of her father's previous family, a smiling woman with 2 young children and a girl of her own age. For the first time Ophelia recognized the likeness between herself and Sarah. She might have been staring at her own face. She even bit her nails and chewed her lip like you do, said Bill. And I didn't mean academic learning. I was thinking of a lesson of experience. Ophelia handed him the photograph. Did you love her? She asked. Sarah? He said. Veronica, said Ophelia. I loved them all, he said simply. But you don't love Mummy, do you? Bill sighed. Sometimes I think she doesn't want to be loved, he said. Or maybe she does but doesn't know it. Or maybe there are things which are more important than love. Respect, for instance. I've a great deal of respect for your mother, however much I may disagree with her. And growing up is always a painful process, whatever age you're at. Ophelia stared at him in astonishment. Erica's 56, she said. And I'm 65, said Bill. But I haven't stopped learning. Minds continue to evolve. When evolution stops, the species dies, and that applies to individuals as well. Both as individuals, and as a species, we have been lucky to escape extinction, but we cannot afford to stand still. Sorrow is wisdom, the poet said. However bad the experience, we can always learn something from it. And that applies to us all, Ophelia, me and Erica, as well as you and Dwight. It's just bums like McAllister who never learn. Erica believes he's right, Ophelia said quietly. Children of the dust. Bill shrugged. In that case you must make up your own mind. The small convoy of army trucks left for Milford Haven and returned 5 days later loaded with supplies of petrol. Then, for the first time in 7 years, the helicopter was able to make a full aerial survey. Photographs taken over Wiltshire and Gloucestershire and Somerset showed the latest information on refoliation, reforestation, bird life, animal life, and the small communities of human survivors. Progress reports were updated, relevant details relayed to the Berkshire bunker for inclusion in central government records, and Bernard Sowerby had to begin all over again with the maps. Like everyone else, Ophelia heard that the Somerset levels were beginning to recover, the acres of peat bogs and water meadows showing green again. Migratory birds nested among those beds and raised their young. Several hundred people in 3 small villages grew wheat and potatoes in fields on the edge of the marshes. Sheep flourished in the Cotswold valleys and 2 small woolen mills seemed to be working. Communities thrived on the Quantock and Mendip hills, and on the edges of Exmoor. Fishing fleets operated out of Porlock, Watchet, and Minehead, and the goat population that grazed the Wiltshire Downs had increased in numbers. But the grey-black deserts were still the dominant feature, Bernard Sowerby said, and apart from the river margins nothing grew in the county of Avon, and no people lived there but themselves. The time had come, General McAllister decided, to start looking outward. There was enough grass on the river fields to support a sizable flock of sheep, and a small herd of cattle had been spotted in the hills of West Gloucestershire beyond the River Severn. Bring them in, McAllister ordered Colonel Allison. I want those cattle here under government protection. That same evening White re-entered Ophelia's life. Just after they had returned from dinner in the dining hall he came bursting into their apartment. He was taller than she remembered, leaner and stronger, with raw blisters on the palms of his hands. He was obviously angry about something and did not speak to her or Erica. Have you heard the latest? He asked Bill. What in particular, Dwight? McAllister's requisitioning the Outsiders' cattle. Every last one of them. Wayne said. Papa received orders this afternoon. They're loading them into the army trucks and transporting them back here. Erica slipped on her white laboratory overall. Her eyes glittered behind her spectacles. With fresh supplies of animal protein we can guarantee our survival, she said. We'll be able to increase the population of the bunker. What about the survival needs of the Outsiders? White asked angrily. To hell with them, I suppose? They're in our administrative district, Erica explained. It's no different from people paying taxes before the war, or tithes for the church. They may not like it, but that's how the system works. Then the system is immoral, Dwight said furiously. It's blasted serfdom, class division, history repeating itself. What gives us the right to set ourselves up over them? Let them do all the donkey work and take what we want. Even Pop says it stinks. Erica tried to tell him. What belonged to the government belonged to all people. That way resources would be shared equally and not be enjoyed by just a few. That was not how it had been before the Holocaust, Dwight argued. Equal sharing had never been a quality displayed by Western civilization. Their whole society had revolved around personal greed, the amassing of goods and money by individuals and nations. Even within the rich industrial countries, the poor, and the sick, and the unemployed had not gotten much of a share. And in the rest of the world millions were left to starve. Erica shrugged. The requisitioning of supplies by the government was common practice during a national crisis, she said. For the sake of the nation, individuals were expected to make personal sacrifices. And it was a fact of life, even among animal communities, that some were born to lead and others to follow. Dwight should be thankful he had been born to a privileged position inside the bunker, she said. That's crap, said Dwight. The biggest load of autocratic hogwash I've ever heard. It's just a bloody excuse. The concept of social superiority among people is a corruption of animal practices. And I'm not a baboon, even if you are. Cool it, said Bill. That was uncalled for. Dwight rounded on him. You were the one who taught me to think before I swallowed bullshit. And if that's not bullshit, I don't know what is. You heard what she said. Tell her, for Christ's sake. We can't let McAllister get away with this act of banditry. Just cool it, Bill repeated. We've got to do something, Dwight said. Bill held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. All right, I agree with you. Let's concentrate on that, shall we? Let's talk about what we can do, calmly and constructively. Firstly, we need a general consensus of opinion on the issue. Then we need a joint decision on what action we are prepared to take. A withdrawal of labor maybe. I'm not listening to this, Erica snapped. We need to discuss it, said Bill. I want no part in it, Erica shouted. You go ahead and discuss it, if that's what you want, but leave me out of it. I'm going to the laboratory. I've been insulted enough for one evening. She stormed out and slammed the door. In the room there was silence. I'm sorry, said Dwight. I shouldn't have called her a baboon. Take a seat, Bill said wearily. Dwight plumped down on the vacant chair. Foam rubber stuffing oozed from a split in the red plastic covering and the air conditioning softly hummed. White words glowed on the small computer screen before Bill reached over and turned it off. Ophelia bit her fingernails and waited. She did not know whose side she was on, or if she agreed with Erica or Dwight. Pop's leaving at first light, said Dwight. Which doesn't give us much time, said Bill. Suppose we warn them? Mac, Alistair and his cronies are hardly likely to listen. No, said Dwight. Suppose we warn the outsiders. That would mean stealing an army truck, said Bill. And I can't drive, said Dwight. But I can, said Bill. Are you with me? Do you know where these cattle are? Bernard Sorby can photocopy a map. I think it's a place called Dean, in West Gloucestershire. I know it, said Bill. Daddy used to live there, said Ophelia. For the first time since he had entered the room, Dwight actually looked at her, noticed she was there. We're going to have to leave before morning, he said. Can you nick us some travel rations from the canteen kitchen? Ophelia made up her mind. If Dwight and her father were leaving, then so was she, and it had nothing to do with right or wrong, or who she believed. It was not a decision. It was instinct. I'll get the rations, Ophelia said. And you can get the protective suits. Daddy's size 20, and I'm a size 14. You are not coming, said Dwight. You are not leaving me here. This isn't a blasted joyride. I'm coming, Ophelia said stubbornly. And you can't stop me. Unless you want me to go and tell General McAllister what you're about to do. I'm not staying here anyway, not without Daddy. Something might happen and nobody knows what outsiders are like. So I'm coming with you. Tell him, Daddy. I guess she's coming with us, Dwight, said Bill. Like many others, Colonel Allison believed that the leadership of every bunker should be democratically elected, that General McAllister had hung on to his position for long enough. But unlike Dwight, He was no revolutionary. Orders were orders, he said, and if he did not carry them out then someone else would. Dwight and Bill must do what they thought to be right, and so must he. You won't report them, Jeff? Mrs. Allison said anxiously. The whole thing is distasteful enough without that, said Colonel Allison. If those cattle are gone by the time I get there then I'm not answerable for it. Whatever you choose to do, Harnden, I know nothing about it. We need a truck, said Dwight. The keys are in the ammunition room, said Colonel Allison. And the trucks are all tanked up. Best take a rifle whilst you're about it. Those wild dogs are not only savage, they're rabid. The key to the ammunition room is in the top drawer of my desk. Think I'll stroll on down to the recreation room for a game of pool. The door closed behind him. And Dwight took the key. I've got to do it, Mom, he said. Mrs. Allison smiled sadly. Then looked at Ophelia and Bill. What about Erica? She asked. I'm not sure I can tell her, said Bill. If you do, said Dwight, we'll get no further than the main tunnel. She wants those cattle brought here. Mrs. Allison frowned. You two can go, she said to Dwight and Ophelia. I have a few things to say to Bill, in private. Dwight and Ophelia went to the armory. They stole the ignition keys for the lead truck parked in the tunnel, plus a submachine gun and ammunition belt. They stole food and water bottles from the canteen and returned to wait in the apartment. They were already dressed in their white protective suits when Bill arrived. He too dressed in a white protective suit as Dwight shouldered a backpack, and Ophelia carried the gun. It was 20 to midnight by the apartment clock. We should have a clear 8-hour start, said Dwight. You go ahead, said Bill. What do you mean? Ophelia asked in alarm. I mean, wait for me in the truck. I'll be along in a minute, said Bill. What's the hold-up? Dwight asked suspiciously. Erica opened the door. She had returned early from the laboratory and Ophelia's heart sank. They did not need to tell her their intention. It was obvious they were leaving, going outside. But Erica's reaction was not what Ophelia expected. No scathing remarks, no blazing anger, no recriminations or blame, just a broken desperate glance at her only daughter before she crossed the room, rested her head on Bill's shoulder and started to cry. Dwight hustled Ophelia from the room. That's no place for us, he said. But what's the matter with her? Ophelia asked. Use your imagination, Dwight said. Chewing her lip, Ophelia followed him along the corridor. The lighting was dimmed at night to conserve energy and there was no one about. Apartment doors were closed and most people slept. And it had never been necessary to guard the bunker at night because the outer doors could be opened only from the inside. Dwight entered the console room and pulled the release lever, then led Ophelia on past the dining hall and storage depot, along the pavement of the main tunnel until they reached the leading army truck. She watched him stow the gun and kit bag in the back with 2 drums of petrol, then climbed into the cab and sat beside him to wait. It was airy and quiet. Moonlight shone at the end of the tunnel and his fingers drummed restlessly on the steering wheel. What's taking Daddy so long? She asked. Sometimes, said Dwight, you were so thick I can hardly believe it. If you're so damn clever why don't you tell me? What the hell do you think they're doing? Said Dwight. How would you feel if the man you had lived with and loved for 20 years suddenly decided he was leaving? We won't be coming back, you know. Ophelia looked at him in alarm. What do you mean? Of course we'll be coming back. Dwight switched on the ignition. His face showed green by the dashboard lights and it had never occurred to Ophelia that Erica might care, or that they might be leaving forever. What do you mean about not coming back? She repeated. And Dwight had to spell it out for her. He said they were burning their boats as far as General McAllister was concerned, defecting to the other side, political traitors and enemies of the state. He said that unless McAllister were ousted by liberal sympathizers they would have to seek political asylum among the outsiders. Traitors, said Dwight, were either imprisoned, executed, or excommunicated. Ophelia had not thought of that. She had not thought of anything much. It was emotion that had driven her, a need to be with her father because he was the only person who had ever really loved her. Maybe she had wanted to be with Dwight, and that was emotional too. Doubts besieged her. She did not really want to leave the bunker, and she certainly did not want to spend the rest of her life among outsiders. Maybe she ought to stay with Erica? Maybe other things were more important than her need to be loved? Maybe it was not too late to change her mind? But her father climbed into the cab and the engine roared into life. Sick fear gripped her as the truck emerged into the vast abandoned darknesses of earth and sky, headed towards an unimaginable future below unknown stars. "Is Erica okay?" Dwight asked. "She won't tell, if that's what you mean," said Bill. "No," said Dwight. "That's not what I meant. I mean, is she alright?" Bill raised his voice above the roar of the engine. "The conflict between personal loyalty and public duty is something she's never had to cope with before. I left her with your mother." "Good old Mom," Dwight said bleakly. "She'll stand by anyone, even me." "We are doing the right thing," Bill assured him. "Are we?" said Dwight. "Right for us and right for the outsiders, maybe. But not right by McAllister according to central government policy." "To thine own self be true," said Bill. "In spite of the majority?" "Once upon a time," said Bill, "the majority believed the world was flat. They crucified Christ and allowed the nuclear war to happen. Individuals give rise to new majorities, Dwight." Dwight laughed. "These last 6 months spent spreading shit, I actually thought it was me who was crazy. I reckoned that if guys like McAllister were sane, then I had got to be mad." "Nice to know I'm not the only nutcase, Bill." "It seems there are 3 of us," Bill replied. "Am I?" thought Ophelia. And physically she was with them. But in her mind she was totally alone. It was 5 o'clock on a summer's morning, and they had been traveling all night, northward along the line of a motorway with endless detours around the rubble of its bridges. Bright stars had shone on an alien landscape where the wind whipped up clouds of dust, and the noise of the engine, the smell of petrol, and the shuddering vibrations of the truck, were making Ophelia feel sick. Now the low sun dazzled her eyes, and she lowered the tinted visor of her helmet, and the road dissolved among the blackened vitrified remains of factories, and housing estates, and flattened miles of wreckage. "Gloucester," said her father. Dwight studied the map. "We'll have to go around it," he said. "Can't we stop for a while?" Ophelia begged. "We'll stop when we reach the river," said Bill. The truck drove on towards barren hills, lurched and jolted over tussocks of grass, fallen masonry, and crumbling concrete. Horizons swayed and tilted, and dust grimed the windscreen. They were searching for the tracks of the convoy trucks that had traveled this way to Milford Haven, but weeks of weather had erased all traces. Sunlight shimmered over the ruins of the city and over the black deserts surrounding it, and the sky was so blue it hurt to see. Time passed and heat built up inside the cab. "I've got to get out," Ophelia said desperately. "Not yet," said Dwight. "I'm going to be sick." He leaned across her and wound down the window. "Do it out there," he said. Neither he nor her father seemed to care how sick she was. They only cared about reaching the outsiders before Colonel Allison. Ophelia heaved up by along a stretch of moving asphalt, dust blew in her eyes and the landscape turned watery, a black molten desert where fence posts trailing wire marked the boundaries of what had once been fields. A rusting yellow road sign, twisted and broken, said that the road they were on was the Golden Valley Bypass. "We're too far north," shouted White. Bill reversed the truck in a scream of tires on dust. In mid-heave Ophelia fell backward and was sick on the floor of the cab. Dwight was furious. "I couldn't help it," Ophelia wept. And still her father drove on, heading back towards Gloucester. It seemed like hours before they reached the river. Noise and the silence screamed in Ophelia's head. The stink stayed in her nostrils and her legs felt like jelly as Bill led her down the bank. Dwight was already filling a container with muddy water to clean out the cab, and if looks could have killed Ophelia would have been dead. But she was past caring. She lay among damp earth and rushes, stripped off her white protective suit. The arched shadows of Telford's Bridge kept off the blistering effects of the sun's rays, and the river swirled by her, leaving its traces on her ungloved hands. She sluiced her face, sat with her head on her knees and waited. Long slow minutes trickled away, but finally the echoes of the engine noise faded and other sounds took over. She could hear her father talking and Dwight pumping air into the front tires, yet they were lost among the silences and the soft running music of the river. The queasy churning of her stomach was gone into the stillness where lace-winged flies danced among the sunlight and fish bubbles broke the surface. Brown water whirled and eddied with trails of green weed. A dragonfly flashed turquoise and insects sang, and a small flower crushed by her fingers gave off a sweet elusive scent. The flowers were everywhere under her, a spreading purple, mat of sheer fragrance. Ophelia gazed in a kind of wonderment. Sense impressions which she had never dreamed of, never imagined, stirred and awoke, and were overwhelmed. This was the world that had been destroyed, the world her father talked of. Sense and sights, colors and sounds, the sweet fresh air and the green glory of grass. It was a little strip of paradise beside an English river where life was beginning again. A brown bird warbled on a branch of springing willow, and the dragonflies danced. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Those were the words her father had taught her, and she had never understood what they meant until now. Back at the bunker there was no beauty like this. Here there was a wallflower growing from the old stones of the bridge, living petals, yellow streaked with scarlet, and the flies above the water were like winged jewels. Ophelia wished she could stay there forever, but the shadow of Dwight fell darkly on the grass beside her. "Feeling better?" he asked. "What do you care?" Ophelia said angrily. "We've got to move on," said Dwight. "We've only just got here. And why don't we move from the bunker and settle somewhere like this?" "The river floods in spring and autumn," Dwight informed her. "Somewhere else then?" "It's not easy living outside," Dwight said. He squatted beside her, stared at his hands, calloused and hard with healed scars of blisters. Even above the smell of petrol, Ophelia was aware of the sewery stink which seemed to be ingrained in him. Dwight had been working outside long enough to know the back-breaking labor entailed in trying to make the deserts grow. She understood what drove him. She knew England would never again be what it was, that General McAllister was blind not to see it, that Eric was stupid to dream. But Ophelia belonged to that dream, an underground city with flowers, and water gardens, trees growing under artificial sunlight, birds and animals and people. It took courage to give up the dream and face reality, and Ophelia knew she would never be brave. They crossed the Severn by Telford's Bridge, which was the only one left standing, and Dwight took the wheel. Learning to drive the truck meant traveling slowly along roads of dust between dead hedges and abandoned villages as they headed west towards the borders of Wales. A hot summer wind blew through the open windows, and on the river's floodplain the grass had dried brown, supporting nothing but a few skinny sheep that roamed across the miles. They saw dogs in the distance but no signs of people, nor any sign of pursuit. But somewhere behind they knew the convoy trucks would be following, qualified army drivers who could make up time and already knew the route. Ophelia slept for a while with her head on her father's shoulder, and when she awoke they were driving among rugged hills where gaunt skeletons of dead trees were still standing. Bare branches trailed dark ivy, sucking a little life from the ruined earth. Here and there among the burnt black ash were fronds of green bracken, patches of grass and a few pink foxglove flowers. Rabbits with blind white eyes bolted away, and the village houses were almost intact. Black gaps of doors and windows and sagging roofs. Rooms and gardens were choked with stinging nettles and bramble mounds, leaves of elder hanging limp in the heat and gray with dust. All these alien plants Bill recognized and named, but Ophelia was feeling ill again. Waves of sickness washed over her and she sweated inside her white protective suit. "I want to get out," she said faintly. "Just a few more miles," said Bill. Roads had reverted to wilderness and the truck swerved and jolted over rough ground as Dwight detoured to avoid a fallen tree, shuddered up the slope and rumbled down into the next valley. Ophelia saw the village ahead, stone-built cottages where smoke billowed from the chimney stacks. 5 skinny cattle grazed in a paddock by the stream. Small fields grew wheat and potatoes and arable crops. Children, goats and chickens wandered around the dusty compound of the street, scattered and fled as the truck drove in. People watched from the inside darkness of decaying rooms, and one little girl, blind and legless, heaved herself along on a makeshift wooden trolley. Fat flies fed upon the festers of her eyes, and Ophelia fought down the sickness as Dwight stuck his head through the window and asked her the way. The child pointed, and the truck drove on past a stone quarry and a churchyard and an abandoned coal mine, and on again over the hills and down through the cracked streets of a deserted town. Surrounding hills were tinged with the pinkness of willow herb, and a few sapling birch trees grew among the forests of the dead. It was afternoon by the sun, and the heat was stifling, and the land her father had expected to recognize seemed unfamiliar and changed. He had to study the map. How much further? Ophelia moaned. Just a few more miles. You said that hours ago. And I bet that village was the place we were looking for. 5 cows don't make a herd, said Bill. Which way now? asked Dwight. Then, from the top of the next rise, Ophelia saw the settlement before her. It was in a valley surrounded by hills, a collection of shacks, a few battered glass houses, and a stone-built cottage and barn. But the squalor was lost in the fields around it, acres of wheat and potatoes, rows of string beans and ripe red strawberries, and velvet green pasture by the stream where the cattle grazed. Tall hedges of flowering elder made a mottled shade. There were willows by the water and young trees foresting the hills beyond. Someone had cleared and planted. Someone had made the desert bloom in the glory of green. Ophelia could actually feel the coolness and peace of it. Johnson's place, said Bill. You know it? Dwight asked him. I've just this minute recognized where I am. It used to be a market garden. I remember bringing Sarah here. It looks pretty well organized, said Dwight. So what are we waiting for? Ophelia asked. They could be armed, said Dwight. Johnson was a pacifist, said Bill. It may not be Johnson, not after 20 years. So why don't we go and see? Ophelia repeated. The truck rattled and banged down the hillside, then lurched to a stop. Tangled fortifications of rusting barbed wire encircled the settlement, half buried in gorse and bracken and brambles, which they had been unable to see from above. It was a trap for dogs and people alike, and barbed wire gates were padlocked against them, blocking the track. Doesn't look exactly friendly, said Dwight. Bill put his hand on the horn, sound blasting through the heat and stillness and echoing around the surrounding hills. After a while they saw a woman coming towards them, walking slowly between bean fields scarlet with flowers. Her stomach was huge in the last weeks of pregnancy, and she was carrying a gun. Her sparse brown hair was matted and unkempt, her dress thin and colorless after years of washing. Ophelia pushed up her visor, waited as Dwight and her father left the truck and went to meet her, watched as the woman leveled the gun. Her finger touched the trigger and it was aimed at Bill. It was not fear of her father's death that made Ophelia cry out, tear off her protective helmet and hurl herself from the cab. It was the sight of a face in the sunlight, burned red and blistering, hideously scarred, human deformity that made her instantly sick. At the foot of a gorse bush Ophelia heaved and vomited until she had nothing left to bring up. Liquid colors, leaf green, sky blue and golden, slowly revolved and grew still. The journey was over and voices screamed through the still heat. Go away. There's nothing here for the likes of you. You don't understand. We're here to warn you. We've given all we can and there's no more. If we could speak to whoever's in charge. My husband's ill. I'm telling you to go. They're coming to steal your cattle. No one steals. We give. Ophelia staggered towards the gate. It did not matter how ugly the woman was. She knew what it meant to suffer. Please, said Ophelia. All I want is a drink of cold water and a place to lie down. The woman regarded her. Blue human eyes gazed at her from the ulcerated remains of a face. Even in decay her eyes were still young, still capable of expression. Ophelia was not sure what she saw. Disbelief, astonishment, recognition, even delight. But suddenly the woman dropped the gun, opened the gate and held out her arms to embrace her. Sarah, she cried. You've come back. I thought you were dead. All these years I've been thinking you were dead. Where have you been? And what happened to William? Ophelia stared at her, backed away. It's me, she said. Catherine. Your sister. My God, said Bill. Dwight drove the truck down the track towards the settlement, and Ophelia, followed behind were Catherine and her father. Summer wind disturbed the scent of elderflowers, set the green leaves dancing in flickers of gold shade across her upturned face. The air was liquid with lark songs over the hills and loud with the hum of bees. There were hives by the river, Catherine said, and all of this Johnson had made. He had dreamed of a garden and made it grow from the dust. They leaned on the gate leading into a walled field full of potatoes, and her voice drifted through the wine-sweet air of afternoon. Ophelia's newfound sister telling her story. It had not been easy, she said. They had been 30 people crammed into one small cottage through a nuclear winter 18 months long. She remembered it well, the cold and the darkness and the snow that buried the world. She remembered the days before it had set in, going with Johnson in a Land Rover fetching hay and cattle feed for the calves. She had been alone with him then, but as they traveled around to farms and villages others had joined them. They hacked down trees to keep the heating system running, and insulated the shed to keep the generator from freezing. But the lights had stayed burning in the glass houses where the plants grew and the animals were kept. They dug tunnels in the snow, and lived on goat's milk, eggs, beans and potatoes. People had survived in other places too. Some had taken livestock into their homes, people and animals sharing the same warmth. Some had eaten the dead meat frozen in the snow, rats and corpses, insects and worms, rotting vegetables and even manure. Even when the winter was over it had not been easy. There was disease, and sickness, and starvation, and babies were born deformed. But slowly, over the years, they had consolidated their hold on the land and established separate communities. Things were getting better, Catherine said. They produced enough food to see them through the winter, ground their own flour and baked bread in the fire ovens. They did not kill animals for meat except when they were old or sickly, but nobody went hungry or cold. They had learned to spin sheep's wool, dye, knit, and weave. They made waterproof clothes out of goat skins, shoes out of cowhide, willow baskets, clay pots, and herbal remedies. "We're hoping to build a communal living house," said Catherine. Johnson said it will be easier to run than individual homes. The old nuclear family system didn't work, so we're going to live and work together. Before the war each family was isolated, which destroyed the spirit of the community. At least, that's how Johnson sees it. "Johnson sounds like a remarkable man," said Bill. "He is," said Catherine. "Quite remarkable. He thought of everything." When the snows receded, he took the Land Rover for a trip to the local libraries and brought back all the books we were likely to need. People come here if they want to know anything, and Johnson teaches them, from the books. We're a kind of distribution center. I think we've supplied almost every settlement in the area with seeds and livestock, although not all of them have cattle yet. Johnson believes that the stuff of life, like knowledge itself, belongs to all people, and we have no right to keep things to ourselves. Right from the beginning, however little we had, we always shared it. "The true spirit of communism," her father murmured. "Yes," said Catherine. "But now Johnson is dying." "I'm sorry to hear that." "We shall miss him," Catherine said simply. She spoke of Johnson like a holy man, with relevance in her voice. Yet Ophelia knew that nobody was perfect. She had only to look at Catherine, her weeping sunburn and rotting teeth, stringy hair that failed to conceal the radiation sores that festered on her scalp, to see that ugliness and suffering still existed, even here in the garden paradise Johnson had created. "Is this your first child?" Bill asked. Catherine laughed. "I've had 7, she said. "But they all died except Lilith. But I pray each day that this baby will survive, for Johnson won't live long enough to father another." Bill looked at her in horror. "You were married to Johnson?" "Since I was 14, said Catherine. "And how old was he?" Catherine shrugged. 40 maybe? Does it matter? I was mature and lived with him, and we cared for each other. It was natural to mate. What else could we have done?" Ophelia stared at her. The loveliness of the valley, the sanctity of its life, fled to a hideous reality. It was horrible, unthinkable. Sexual intercourse between a 14-year-old girl and a 40-year-old man. Breeding like animals, having no choice, pregnancy after pregnancy, and all the children dying. Catherine's great swollen stomach seemed suddenly obscene, the result of one more sordid act of conception. Ophelia's lips set in a prim line of disgust as she walked away, down the track. At least in the bunker they had kept morality alive. And the green growing fields ended abruptly in a compound of dust. Nothing beautiful remained, just battered glass houses, a filthy cottage and ramshackle barns, and the settlement beyond. It was a scene of absolute squalor. Hundreds of wooden shacks with polythene windows and rusting corrugated roofs faced across the sunbaked spaces where the army truck was parked. Garden sheds, she heard her father saying. And people actually lived in them. Over 700 people, Catherine said, although most of them were away in the hills picking bilberries, or quarrying for stone for the new communal living hall. The stink was terrible. Flies buzzed around the primitive latrines and rats frisked across the garbage dump, white eyes winking in the light. It was no wonder Catherine's babies died. No one could live in conditions like these. The land came first, Catherine said, food and necessities before material advancement and academic learning. They would not be living like this forever, she said, and pointed out the foundation trenches for the new building. Meanwhile among the germs and filth the woman sang and small children cried. Fowls bathed in the dust and goats chewed their cud in the wooden shade of the sheds before the valley grew green again, curved with a stream between hills where the bright woods brooded, and the willow herb bloomed sweet. A mixture of feelings tore Ophelia apart. She saw the coexistence of hope and despair, beauty and ugliness, the profane and the sublime. Caught between wonder and loathing she walked through the reek of dung and flowers to stand beside White and the shadow of the army truck. "What do you think of it?" he asked her. "I think it stinks," Ophelia said savagely. "Figuratively? Or literally?" "Both. It makes me feel absolutely sick. At least we've managed to maintain a decent standard of living. At least we're still capable of civilized behavior." "Like coming to steal their cattle?" said White. "You call that civilized? We're dinosaurs in a bunker. We deserve to become extinct." Ophelia stared at him. "What do you mean?" she said. "What I said," he retorted. "And what did you expect? Bleached Jerusalem?" In the kitchen White pumped water into a cracked china sink and sluiced his face as Ophelia followed her father into the living room. Just for a moment, after the blinding sunlight outside, she could see nothing. But slowly the room took shape. Chairs and a table, an old-fashioned fireplace, ragged curtains at the window and a dirt-encrusted carpet on the floor, books stacked in every available space. The air was heavy with the smell of books, and in the midst of them, reclining on a battered sofa, was a bearded man, a skin and bone shape clad in nothing but a pair of faded denim shorts. "This is Johnson," Catherine said fondly. He looked so old, many years older than Ophelia's father. His scalp, like Catherine's, was covered with festering sores. He tried to rise but his strength failed. Breath rattled in his throat as he sank back against the cushions. One skeletal hand extended in greeting as Bill stepped forward. "My father," said Catherine. Johnson coughed and nodded. His teeth were gone. But his voice was strong and sure. "We've met before, I think, but I forget your name." "2 boxes of pansies, wasn't it?" "Pansies for thoughts," Bill quoted. "Just call me Bill. And this is Ophelia, my other daughter." "I thought she was Sarah," Catherine explained. Johnson smiled. "The fair Ophelia," he said. "How beautiful you are. I had forgotten how beautiful the human face could be." Ophelia wanted to hate him. She wanted to hate him for all he had done to Catherine, for all the corruption she had found in the heart of this valley. But he was dying, and Catherine was a woman now. 28, she had told her father. Their hands touched and his eyes softened with affection. He called her his darling Kate, and asked her to make some tea. He seemed to radiate a kind of inner light, a transparency of warmth and love it was impossible to hate. "First," said Catherine, "I must take Ophelia upstairs and find her a bed." "She's ill?" Johnson asked anxiously. "It's only travel sickness," Ophelia said. "Come," said Catherine, and held out her hand. Ophelia followed her reluctantly, up a dim wooden stairway and into an upper room. Dusty sunlight filtered through the grimy window and the crumpled sheets. On a vast double bed were stained and torn. Peeling wallpaper showed a pattern of fading flowers. From a chest of drawers Catherine took out clean linen, stripped off the bed covers. Winston pained, straightened and clutched her back. "You had better let me do that," Ophelia said. She remade the bed as Catherine cleared the floor of soiled clothes and found her a nightdress. It was blue nylon with tattered lace edges. "It's my best," said Catherine. "But you're welcome to borrow it. The bathroom is next door. There's septic tank drainage and a flush toilet, the only one on the site. When Lilith returns I'll ask her to make you a cure for your sickness. I'll just go and fetch you a glass of water." "You shouldn't be waiting on anyone in your condition," Ophelia told her. Catherine smiled. "It's a perfectly normal condition for a woman, and I've Lilith to help me when she gets home. You lie down and rest." "You are the one who should be resting," Ophelia objected. Catherine sighed. "It wouldn't make any difference," she said. "I've been through it enough times before. The little one's fate has nothing to do with rest and nourishment. It's genetics, Johnson says. We're genetically damaged, you see? Lilith laid the last one outside in the snow. Better a quick death than weeks of suffering. The poor little thing was too deformed to live for very long, and Lilith always sees what chance of life a baby has. Sometimes I think she sees too much, but Johnson says we have to heed her, however hard it seems." It was horrible. Everything about this place was horrible. Lilith had killed her own mother's child, and Ophelia did not want to meet her. She wanted to go home, back to the bunker, blot out everything she had heard and seen. Her head ached violently. Her stomach churned, and voices murmured in the rooms below. "Will you ask Daddy to bring my water?" Ophelia said. "I want to talk to him." Catherine nodded, opened the windows, drew the curtains, and went downstairs. Ophelia undressed, put on the blue nylon nightdress and lay on the bed. The clean sheets smelled of lavender. Sleepy afternoon sounds of birds and children drifted in from outside, and the curtains fluttered in the breeze. Cool shades surrounded her. She wanted to sleep, but she had to wait for her father. She had to tell him that no matter what happened, no matter what the punishment was, she wanted to go home, back to the bunker, away from this cruel outside world which she could not bear. When Ophelia awoke, the room was dim with shadows. It must have been evening by the smells of smoke and cooking, the noise and bustle of the settlement outside. But the room contained its own silence, and she was suddenly aware that she was not alone. Ophelia turned her head. A skinny flaxen-haired girl stood beside her bed with a cup in her hand. In the dusky half-light Ophelia could not see her clearly, just the pale oval of her face, the smudges of her eyes, a wraith-like figure in the shapeless gray dress. Ophelia sat up. "I asked Daddy to bring my water," she said. The girl stared at her, unseeing eyes taking her in. She pointed to the bedside table where a glass of water stood, then thrust the cup into Ophelia's hands and gestured her to drink. "What is it?" Ophelia asked suspiciously. The gesture was repeated, and Ophelia drank. Liquid that was strong and bitter and as cold as ice. A herbal brew. Something to cure the sickness, Catherine had said. It tasted horrible, but the still imperious gaze of the girl stayed fixed on her face, ruthlessly commanding her to finish every last drop. Then she took back the cup and turned to go. Light from the passageway touched her eyes, the blank whiteness of the congenitally blind. Radiation damage. She had obviously been born dumb as well as blind. Just for a moment Ophelia pitied her until the girl paused in the doorway and looked back. Fear crawled through the nerves of her stomach. She got the feeling that the girl was not blind at all, that she could see everything Ophelia was, and the pity was all on her. "Are you Lilith?" she asked. And the girl nodded her head. Morning sun lay bright outside the window, but sleep sucked at Ophelia's mind and she had to struggle to open her eyes. Her father was shaking her, ordering her to wake, trying to tell her something. Cattle and childbirth and Colonel Allison were all mixed up together. She was drugged and dozy, unable to understand. He had to shake her again and make her sit up. "Are you listening?" asked Bill. "Lilith," muttered Ophelia. "She's downstairs. Catherine's in labor and Colonel Allison is on his way. I want you to keep an eye on White. He's all steamed up and likely to do something stupid. Johnson and I are going to try reason, and White's not in the mood for that. You'll have to keep him out of the way. Take him for a walk, or something." "But what about the cattle?" Ophelia asked. "I've just told you," said Bill. "What's the matter with you? They're milk cows mostly, and in calf heifers. We couldn't get them away because there's nowhere to drive them to, nowhere else with enough grass to feed a herd that size. We got the stud bulls away last night, but the rest are still here." Bill tossed her clothes on the bed. "Just take care of White," he said. "That's all I ask." "I want to go home," Ophelia stated. "When this is over. Is that a promise?" "Of course," Bill said impatiently. "I already promised your mother. There's work to do at the bunker and you don't want to stay here, do you?" He went away and Ophelia sighed happily, lay back against the pillows and closed her eyes. Erica had made Bill promise, and they would be going home. She did not care what happened now. Maybe she had never really cared, not even if Catherine was her sister. The problems of the outsiders were not her problem. They had problems of their own back at the bunker, and that was where Ophelia belonged. Dwight too. There was something she had to do about Dwight. Something her father had told her which she could not remember because all she wanted to do was sleep, and sleep and sleep. Downstairs someone was screaming. Ophelia shot out of bed, grabbed her underwear and overall and started to dress. Catherine was having the baby and she had to help, Bill had said. Her head was so muzzy she could hardly think. She went to the window and breathed in the chilly morning air. It was still early. The sky was changing from pearly pink to blue, the glass houses misted with condensation, the bean fields sparkling with dew. Johnson and her father were going slowly up the track and the settlement was coming away. Women collecting firewood from the stack, men emptying the lavatory buckets, and a solitary child drawing water from the well. Ophelia stared at him, a stark naked little boy of 6 or 7 with bulbous joints and rickety legs. He seemed to be carrying something on his shoulders, allowing fleshy growth the size of a human head. And then she saw that it was a head, a second head attached to a second neck, but only partly formed, a hideous fetal thing with a bulging brain. In pity and revulsion Ophelia turned away and went downstairs. Lilith was sitting on the sofa where Johnson had lain. She sat with her hands in her lap as if she were waiting, an evil child who killed her mother's babies and put sleeping potions in people's drinks. Behind the closed sitting room door Catherine moaned in pain and Ophelia knew what Lilith was waiting for. She went through to the kitchen where saucepans of water simmered on the wood-burning stove. White was seated at the table eating bread and jam and he did not even look at her. "There's a boy outside," Ophelia began. "I saw him," said White. "It made me feel sick. According to the midwife they're all born deformed in one way or another," Dwight told her. "She's in there now seeing to your sister." Ophelia helped herself to bread and jam. "Lilith killed the last baby," she said. "She left it outside in the snow to die." "Poor kid," said Dwight. "What strength she must have." "She murdered it," Ophelia said. "Kind of," said Dwight. "Johnson told me last night. Not murder in their eyes, but mercy killing. Apparently they've practiced it since the beginning. Adults too, once they reach the last stages of dying." He turned his head as Lilith entered the kitchen. "Hi, Lilith. How's it going?" And the horror smiled in answer to her name. In the bright daylight Ophelia could see her quite clearly, her white fair hair hanging straight and long, and pale downy hairs on her face and arms, almost like fur. She definitely was not blind. White eyes with black pinprick pupils fixed her with a cold repelling stare before Lilith took the saucepan from the stove and carried it away. Once again Ophelia felt the fear. She had seen those eyes before in rats, and sheep, and rabbits. She recognized the significance. "Lilith's a mutant," she said. "That's evolution for you," said White. "You don't understand. The mutant gene is a dominant gene. Think what it means. Her children will inherit her characteristics." "That's right. Eventually all outsiders will be mutants. Unless we can make a breakthrough in genetic engineering, we're going to be overrun. We've got no future anyway," said White. "What do you mean? Of course we've got a future. We've survived, haven't we? Dinosaurs in a bunker," White repeated. "We may have survived, but we haven't adapted. We're trying to cling to a lifestyle that is obsolete, and even our minds are stagnant. Our outlook hasn't changed since before the war. We couldn't exist outside that bunker, but these people can. They've learned to cope with changed conditions. It's the Liliths of this world who are going to survive in the long run, Ophelia. Not us." From the inner room came a thin baby wailing, an echo of girlish laughter that went on and on, a maniacal glee. Dwight was talking rubbish. Of course the human race was going to survive. Catherine had just given birth to a lively, healthy child, and Ophelia was going to see. The front sitting room was cramped and small. Books on shelves lined all the walls, and half-drawn curtains cut out the natural light. Candles and jam jars smelled of mud and fat, made glowing reflections in the gilt-framed mirror. On a bare scrubbed table, cleared of clutter, the midwife was bathing the baby in a blue plastic bowl whilst Lilith watched and laughed, an insane gurgling sound. Her hands kept reaching to touch it as the midwife slapped them away. And in the corner of the room, on a soiled mattress on the floor, Catherine lay amid the blood-stained aftermath of birth. What remained of her hair was matted with sweat, but her eyes were bright in the candlelight, shining with joy and relief. "It's a girl, Ophelia," Catherine said. "Lilith's baby sister. It's fit and well, and it's going to live. Isn't that wonderful?" She struggled to sit up. "Let me see it," she asked the midwife. "I want to show Ophelia my baby." The midwife wrapped it in an old woolen shawl, brushed aside Lilith's clutching hands, and placed it in Catherine's arms. Gently she opened the shawl for Ophelia to see. The baby was naked, a pale little thing, completely covered in white silky hair, soft and thick as fur. Tiny fingers gripped when Ophelia touched it, and its eyes opened wide. They too were white. Black pinprick pupils seemed to drill through her mind, and the same fear shot through her. Just like Lilith, the baby was deformed, a mutant albino thing. "Isn't she beautiful?" said Catherine. "Aye," said the midwife. "And more like her. I have birthed this year than any other, fine strong babies, all of them. Genetic mutation, natural adaptation." Supposed White were right? "She's very sweet," Ophelia said sickly. And Lilith laughed. Johnson was dying of radiation-induced cancer, and a walk up the track to meet Colonel Allison had left him exhausted. The cough racked his lungs, and he lay on the sofa with Lilith beside him, the new baby cradled in his arms. Just for a moment his death did not matter, nor the fate of his cattle. He could still smile, still take delight from the sight of his new little daughter, Lilith's sister with her snow-white fur and milky eyes. "Another little visionary," Johnson said softly. "What will you call her?" asked Bill. "Allison," said Johnson. Colonel Allison shifted uncomfortably. "You are naming her after me? After what I'm here to do?" "I don't take it personally," Johnson said. "You make me feel like a heel," said Colonel Allison. "Which is what you are," said White. "I didn't come here to argue with you, Junior." "No," said White. "You came to thieve their cattle." Johnson gave the baby back to Lilith to return to her mother. Outside the compound was full of men with rifles and white protective suits, and a dozen army trucks were parked on the hilltop. "Let's get down to business," Johnson said. And Colonel Allison placed the official requisition order on the table. The Avon bunker, he explained, was the administrative headquarters for the Southwest region, and the cattle would be transferred there to be reallocated throughout the whole administrative district. "Like hell they will," said White. "They'll be reallocated via McAllister's gut, more like." "Is that my fault?" asked Colonel Allison. "You were here, aren't you?" "Me or someone else, what does it matter? You had your chance, Junior. I gave you a clear 12 hours start. Those cows should have been out of here and miles away by now." "They're milkers," said Johnson. "Nowhere else can handle such a herd," said Bill. "I'm sorry about that," said Colonel Allison. "I really am. I don't much like what I have to do, but we'll load them onto the trucks after evening milking and be on our way. There will be compensation, of course, paid in pounds sterling. You can name your price." "What good's that?" White yelled. "What good are 5-pound notes to these people except for wiping their backsides on?" "When the economy recovers," said Colonel Allison. "Bullshit," said White. "The economy isn't going to recover. You've got to be an idiot, Pop, if you believe that." "Let's not get carried away," said Bill. "He's talking crap," shouted White. "I'm under orders," said Colonel Allison. "I've got no choice." "Everyone's got a choice, for Christ's sake. Even you. You've got a mind, Pop. Use it. Don't you care how many of these people are left to starve because of your actions? Sod McAllister's beefsteak. Think about what you're doing. You're not bound to be a mindless cretin just because you've got some blasted stripes on your sleeve." "Keep on," said Colonel Allison, "and I'll give you a clip around the ear hole, Junior." "Why don't you go for a walk?" suggested Bill. "I'll stop him if it's the last thing I ever do," Dwight said viciously. "He'll not take those cattle if I have to kick his teeth in." "You were just not helping," said Bill. "Here," said Johnson, "we don't believe in violence, son. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but we'll handle it my way, thank you very much." Dwight stared at him, sharp blue eyes in the sudden silence, then turned on his heel and left the room. Bill closed the door behind him. With Dwight out of the way they could get back to business, and Ophelia sighed. Part of her wished that Colonel Allison would load the cattle and leave immediately, then she too could go home. But there were 700 people at the settlement, dependent on those cattle, milk and butter and cheese, and Johnson was not about to relinquish what he had struggled 20 years to keep. Reallocation, Johnson explained, was already taking place. Eventually every settlement in the area would be supplied with cattle, and he was quite willing to widen his supply area to include Avon and the Cotswolds and anywhere else. "That's reasonable," said Bill. "Except that I'm not empowered to negotiate," said Colonel Allison. "We can't handle a milking herd," said Bill. "We've not got the facilities. Central government policy clearly states." "Government?" said Johnson. "What government is this? I wasn't aware we had a government, and I certainly didn't vote for them. None of us did. You can't just walk in here, Allison, and expect me to believe you represent some non-existent government which I've never heard of." "I do have credentials." "Credentials don't count," said Johnson. "I don't accept them, nor any other declaration of authority. No, Allison. The only power you have over us is force of arms. If you want those cattle, then you'll have to shoot the lot of us in order to take them, or else accept what I'm willing to give you. 2 milkers, 6 calf heifers, and 1 bull. The basis for a herd, and no more." Ophelia yawned. Talk like this was liable to go on all day, and already the sun was climbing towards noon. The settlement sweltered in the heat, and its stink wafted in through the open window. Outside the cottage, the army truck which Dwight had driven was ready to leave, and the soldiers waited for their final orders. Skylarks sang over the pink willow-herb hills, and Colonel Allison was about to give way. He wanted more than Johnson offered, but he was not an inhumane man. He was hardly likely to deprive 700 people of their livelihood. Or was he? Ophelia was never to know. Shots rang out, the vicious rattle of a distant machine gun blasting through the outside silence, shattering speech and birdsong and Ophelia out of thought. A series of huge explosions shook the air as she, and her father, and Colonel Allison rushed outside. Men in white protective suits, who had been sheltering from the sun in the shade of walls, and half the population of the settlement, came running, everyone staring up the hillside to where the army trucks were parked. Black smoke billowed and flames licked the sky. The whole convoy was burning and one solitary figure moved from the inferno and went running across the horizon shouldering a gun. "Dwight," said Colonel Allison. "No," said Ophelia. But she knew he was right. Dwight had set the army trucks on fire. White-suited men went pounding up the track. Colonel Allison fired a revolver in the air. "I want no killing," he shouted. "Go after him and bring him back, but no killing. And see what happened to Denton and Hargreaves. I left them guarding those trucks." The men waved, and saluted, and ran on. "What now?" asked Bill. "You can't drive milk cows across 70-odd miles of desert," Colonel Allison said grimly. "McAllister will have his guts for this, of course." "Providing you catch him," said Bill. Ophelia knew Colonel Allison would never catch up with Dwight. He would lose himself in a wilderness of land and never come back. It was what he had intended, right from the beginning. Dinosaurs in a bunker, he had said. He thought the only future was here, but not for Ophelia. Her future was still in Avon, and the one remaining truck would take her back. She would go home, become a geneticist, and never see Dwight again. Tears rolled down her cheeks and the sunlight burned her. She turned to go back inside. Lilith was standing in the doorway. Her eyes were narrowed in the light and she held the baby in her arms. Black pinprick pupils saw the fire, saw the grief on Ophelia's face, and slow and pityingly she smiled.